Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Juju Show number 47, the one that almost got lost because I just got back from vacation this week and I saw it on the calendar and went, oh no! But we have awesome stuff to talk about, so let's go ahead and squeeze it in. So we got with us today, Corey. How you doing? How's North Carolina? I heard you guys had a big boom.
Yeah, there was, I guess, a gas explosion a couple of towns over in Durham. Nobody I knew was injured. Yeah, it was fine. Everybody's
good.
I actually haven't heard of any injuries, which is really good.
Cool. I've heard that there were windows shaking and rattled like miles away from it, so that's kind of scary. All right, Joe, any dangerous happenings going on over in your neck of the woods?
No, it's all pretty tranquil over here. Beautiful weather.
Tranquil's good.
Spring weather.
All right. And Peter, welcome to the party. How you doing? How's Canada looking?
Good. We got snow yesterday. Quite a bit of it too.
We were supposed to, but we just missed it. It was like freezing stuff that melted right away. So I was very glad that it didn't stick around.
This is the time of year where the city doesn't bother cleaning it up. They just wait for it to melt. It's expensive cleaning up snow.
Yeah, turns out running all those machines and paying those people to do it, right? All right, well, let's get out of the what's happening in your woods and into Juju land. So let's see. News this week. Releases. 2.5.4 went out while I was away, sneakily. Couple of bug fixes in there. If you are tracking anything, you had an issue, just be aware. And as always, get your upgrading on. Juju upgrade. Juju, have fun. Or actually Juju upgrade model. But get your upgrades on. The bigger thing coming, I know that the team's actively looking to try to get the 2.6 beta 1 locked down this week. So you should expect to see it maybe end of this week, maybe beginning of next week, depending on how we get on getting that locked down. So that means we're getting very, very close to test the new release time. All the new Kubernetes stuff in there, a lot of new updates and bug fixes to be in there. So grab that Edge. Sorry, I'm going to say it wrong. The Edge channel on the latest track to try it out. Bootstrap, play with it. Lots of exciting things. I put a link in the show notes for the release notes, which is currently not filled in. But obviously, as we get to the beta, we will need to be filling it in soon this week. So that should have a nice hit list of all the awesome stuff to play with. Joe, I wanted to highlight your post you put. Now, you put this in development, but I thought more folks might find this interesting. And this was basically setting up a local MAS that uses KVM pods to basically be the machines in the MAS so that you could kind of fake out a local MAS deployment. And this seems really interesting. So tell me about this. What did we do here?
It wasn't without its tribulation. Most of it is around, the KVM pods. You can specify that a rack controller is a KVM pod, and therefore it's rather than acting as MAS usually does with finite discrete machines, you can treat that one rack controller as sort of ephemeral storage and have it provide machines to your MAS as KVMs. It works really nicely now. A couple of little problems I have had were that MAS. This is specifically the all local installation. MAS installs bind, and bind by default listens on all interfaces, which tends to trounce a local LexD with its own DNS mask listening on its own subnet. So you have to do a bit of adjustment there. And the other main thing was that I couldn't get external access from my my KVM machines. So that was to do with the network that libvirt sets up for you. Someone who's I'm a fairly shallow user of KVMs, so if someone who's more of an expert might know how to set that up or configure that network using libvirt, rather than what I've done and put in a post, which is to enable proxy up to get out. There may be another way to do that, but Yeah, all I could see that when I made requests, the ARP requests were saying who's got this, but I was not getting any response. And enabling proxy ARP fixed it. But yeah, that's a neat little development tool. If you don't have a fully fledged MAS and you want to check it out, that's how you get set up and it's all running on your machine.
Yeah, I've been really curious what folks do with this. I know we're doing it mainly to develop to kind of mimic what MAS would do and some ideas around there, but it seems like there's some potential where MAS provides tools that maybe a local LXD wouldn't or whatnot to kind of, maybe make for some interesting projects. So I want to highlight that. Everyone go check it out and play with it in some way. Let's see. Oh, next up, there's a discussion and discourse around can a bundle define a model? And this was interesting in that what was actually being asked was, could a bundle declare across multiple models? So there being this idea that I have these things in model A, these things in model B, cross-model relations between them and such. And as we get to the really, really cool use case I see lately is folks that are doing OpenStack and Kubernetes infrastructure, and they want to share things like the Keystone to provide, common identity control across both their OpenStack cloud and their Kubernetes cluster and such. And so there's a cross-model relation folks are playing with around that. There's lots of other use cases you can see around kind of that shared low-level infrastructure across models of things. In the end, the answer is no. Unfortunately, we don't have a concept of that at this time. Bundles are, models are set up to actually contain potentially multiple bundles. And so this idea of the model as a whole is kind of a bigger picture thing than just a bundle is. But there's definitely some interesting use cases in there. It'd be kind of fun to explore what ideas folks have, what use cases they might have, what kind of gaps we have that we should look at filling in future versions of Juju. So it's a very interesting kind of theoretical discussion and cool to see how folks are looking to play with and use the tools in new and stretchy, bendy ways, right? You guys ever wished for something other than bundles, something bigger, badder?
Yeah, I've definitely run across this in the past where it would be really useful to be able to say, I want to deploy my Kubernetes, in one model, and then with, especially with the new Kubernetes models, be able to define a K8s model in that cluster on the same controller, and then have cross-model relations so that you can have, some Kubernetes services providing things back to the cluster like DNS, core DNS, and stuff like that.
Yeah, cool. That's something we'll have to take into future sprints and look at as future ideas. Let's see. Next up, this is another interesting one around another case of I wish I had this, but we don't. And this was a pending hooks counter and a way to inject it into Juju status. And this was a case where I had totally forgotten and I felt bad because I led like, ooh, this is interesting. We should look at this. In that when a charm goes and gets deployed or responds to events, there's a whole list of events and things that are going to happen. And mainly they were kind of, wanting to know where was it, how much of it's, what percent is complete kind of idea, what's left to do. And sometimes a single thing may take 20 minutes and there may be some after, but you don't really realize it. You're sitting there watching this one thing kind of hang and go, well, when this is done, maybe it'll be done. I don't know. It's definitely, I totally understand like why folks would want this. I wasn't a fan of it in status in that I think status was more of like what's going on now. And this kind of idea of, other data, like it's not really interesting to see that count on all the charms because you're not really going to make a decision based on that, but if you're investigating a specific unit, like why is this unit taking so long or what's going on this unit, I can definitely see a detailed unit view around that. What Tim and John brought up though, as far as like how Juju works, and this is where this is a problem, is that there really isn't a known queue that's ready to go. What there is there's this thing called the uniter that runs on each unit, and it comes around and gets told, evaluate what needs to be done. And it basically deltas existing state from needed to be state and builds a to-do list and then goes, what's next? And then does the next thing and comes back around the loop and goes, now what's different? And it keeps going through this, like, this decision loop on what needs to be done. And so there's not really queue to just go print me the contents of queue X, print me the contents of the queue for MySQL 0 or for, Keystone 1 or whatnot. And so it's a little bit of a bigger ask than it might seem at first. But it's another one where I could totally understand and see wanting to understand and something that it'd be good to know, like what kind of impact something has, right? Where you issue a command and then you find out that, oh, I built up a queue of 5 things for the unit to do or 20 things for the unit to do. The other thing that got brought up, and Corey, I'd be interested in your opinion on this one, is that some of this is if in reactive charms, a lot of the decision making what the to-do list isn't actually known to Juju, right? If it's based on flags set on the charms, Juju has no idea that you're waiting for these relations before the flags will be set to kick off these other things that'll happen in the charm. So it can honestly be a bit of a misleading indicator. Like Juju can say, oh, I'm going to trigger a couple of things, but that may turn into 10 by the time the unit actually settles from a charm running perspective.
And Juju doesn't necessarily know what hooks the charm is implementing. So it may say, if you've got one of these, do that, but it doesn't have one.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing that the charms do have access to that I would like to see that would help kind of introspect this, that I'd like to see more visible, is the idea of the goal state, which is basically just allowing you to see what the desired model state is that the uniter is developing that list of hooks from. If you can currently get that using a Juju run invocation, but that gets queued up as as one of the hooks. So if there's something already running on there that's taking a while, you won't be able to access it. It would be nice to be able to get that via like a Juju status type command that doesn't get blocked. And what you could do with that is you could at least get the delta between the current model state and the desired model state to see from Juju's perspective what what things need to change to get it to the point where it would be considered settled from Juju's point of view. But then you're right, from the charm's point of view, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be in a working state, because the charm may have requirements that just haven't been satisfied by the user and need to be provided. I don't think there's any that kind of gets into the territory of what we are wanting to see. We're kind of starting discussions about some new approaches to the charming framework to kind of make things a bit more introspectable and discoverable. Basically, have a better idea of what's going on. If charms don't exactly use a like a state machine, but if they were using something like a state machine, having that, graph of, what the states are and where the various components are would be really useful. Charms are, in fact, with reactive, more of like a rules engine, which is harder to visualize in that regard. But yeah, that's something that we want to focus on in the next cycle, is kind of improving the ability to see from the outside what's going on inside the charm, and where it needs to be and what things are missing. And I think if we could combine that with goal state from Juju's perspective and the ability to see the difference there, we would have a much more kind of debuggable charm experience.
Yeah, what I want to kind of encourage, what I really liked about this discussion, beyond just it's an interesting discussion, was that I really like folks going, man, I wish I had this. This is why I could use it, because then that can feed into our engineering efforts going forward. And while we don't have a good answer of, that's just with this flag here, you can get everything you want. I know sometimes it can be a little bit like, oh man, I just, asking for stuff, but I love it. Like, ask for stuff, what is missing? How's it not working the way you want? Like, I love these conversations, and it's great feedback and stuff to kind of see what folks are doing, what kind of workarounds, or, what people are doing because they don't have something, and having that conversation and feedback. So I just want to keep encouraging everyone to hop into discourse and keep bringing these things up, because as Corey mentions, there's work planning and designing and stuff going in right now. And this is a really interesting piece of feedback to go into that design work. All right. Next one. Oh, I was hoping Eric would be here, but he's not. he has a tutorial he put together on what he called a tiny hooks charm. So Eric is doing some awesome stuff with trying to help work on charming. He's trying to spread charming in his company and had previously done some tutorials that I know, Peter, you've worked with him on around charming with the reactive framework. But, you know, there's a certain amount of reactive knowledge you have to have in your head. And he was teaching folks brand new. And him and I know talked a bunch about what's the lightest weight, thinnest amount, like how could we get charming broken down to the little babyest bits to get folks kicked off and going. And we've always had there's this Ubuntu light charm that John Meinel did, because when we're testing Juju, we want fast. And we don't even want to install like Python dependencies and stuff in order to get reactive to go. Like we just need something that tests the Juju interaction as fast as possible. And so we kind of talked about maybe that would be an interesting, useful kind of way to kick off and get started on some stuff. And what came out of this was his awesome little tiny hooks tutorial charm, which I think is a great little baby step getting started, you know, without a lot of stuff. Now, like all things, people end up writing shell scripts because they just need a few lines of code here, and then things grow, and then they become kind of unmanageable, and then you go get a framework in. You have to learn the framework, but the framework helps organize your code, your logic, and makes it reasonable for working together on a project instead of one person writing what's in their head for a little shell script kind of thing, you know. So I think this has its place in that get started land, and to help lead folks into the, you know, getting them over that hump and into where they could then learn things like the reactive framework and having it kind of go more advanced. You know, there's room to grow, I guess, along the learning curve there. So I just wanted to, you know, thank Eric for his work in putting that together. And I encourage folks to go take a look at it and try it out. And I would encourage folks to try it out on your friend. Like, you know, find yourself a buddy who doesn't do charming now or whatnot, and see how it goes and give Eric feedback, because what's great is these things are kind of evolving tutorials, and it's always great to get, you know, folks trying it and, oh, this almost worked, but here's what I found, or here's the questions that the person I threw it at asked that would be useful to pull in and answer, and make it the kind of best tutorial we can get out of that. Cool. Anyone play with that at all yet? We're all kind of all in on the give me my framework and my tools. Sweet. All righty. So aside from that, that's all I have this week. Peter, you have a main topic for us today. What have you got?
So I'd like to give an introduction to credentials. I think this is going to be useful for people starting out with Juju, but also with maybe answering or illuminating some dark corners of credentials with Juju. So let me, I've actually got a few slides for you all. So let me get that going. So does that come out? You guys see that?
Gotcha. Let's talk about credentials.
Good. All right. So just introduction, basically what is a Juju credential? By the way, some of these slides are going to look a little brutal, but so credentials in general. So we're talking username, password, I call it auth contents or material, and this stuff comes from the cloud vendor, obviously. To add a credential, we use the add credential command. And the user provides an arbitrary credential name. And this becomes the Juju credential. When we're talking about a Juju credential, it's actually referring to that credential name. And a credential in Juju is specific to a cloud and to a Juju user. These credentials are made on Juju clients, on somebody's host, so on a network host, specifically on a system user on that host. So this is all very good, works well, it's lightweight and so on. But there is some things people might want to keep in mind, and just to demonstrate that, I'm bringing up two extreme cases. So you could actually have two hosts with different credential names, but with the same auth content. And then the opposite, you could have two hosts with the same credential names, but with different auth content. So now local credential. This is an important concept. So local means local to the Juju client. And we use a credentials command to list them. So this is output to the credentials command. It's using the YAML format option to get this particular output. And we see here then that Gandalf is a credential, the local credential for Cloud Google, and the currently logged in user. So remember that a credential is always associated with a cloud and a user. And the Juju user actually isn't shown here, and maybe we should show it, but that's for something else. And notice that this output does say local credentials. I'm actually going to stop after each little capsule here in case people have comments or questions. Actually, maybe just if anybody has a question or comment, just interrupt me. I might be better.
So the only thing I would note there is you mentioned like the Juju user, but honestly, the credential isn't tied to a user until you have a controller, right? So, and it could be used in multiple controllers that could be different Juju users. So there's kind of a many to many on that. So there wouldn't be a good way for that. Like what we could possibly do is have on your client say, given this credential, show me everywhere it's used, right, on what all controllers, maybe what users it was on that controller or whatnot. But it's not a one-to-one situation. You could reuse that credential over and over and over again.
Right. That's true. Thanks for that, Rick. So default local credential is another concept that's quite important. So when a local credential is needed, it can be specified with the -- credential option, which is explicit, or it can be specified with the default local credential, which is implicit. So the default local credential can be set in two ways. With the set default credential command, which is a manual operation, or actually with the bootstrap command, which is an automatic operation. The automatic method is only applied when there's a single or a sole local credential existing, when the controller is created. So it's not just that Juju uses a credential by default, it actually sets a thing called default local credential and that has ramifications afterwards. I just want to emphasize that this -- credential option always refers to a local credential. Later, when we talk about remote credentials, we need to sort of remember this fact. This is a cheesy slide. So remote credentials. So Juju has a list of clouds it knows about, whether it's out of the box or whether it's been added by the user. And Juju needs to authenticate to that cloud, and that's done via the controller. Therefore, we need to get a credential to the controller. So the Juju client takes a local credential and uploads it to the controller. And then it becomes known as a remote credential.
And the reason I think I want to make sure that this all happens, right, is that the controller is going to make API calls to that cloud on your behalf using that credential to do things like spin up machines, create storage buckets, all that kind of stuff that Juju is doing to help all your stuff run, right? And it needs to be on that controller because you're going to turn your laptop off, walk away, or whatnot. And so it needs to be able to authenticate as it's doing all that work.
Right. Remote credential, this is actually quite vital. It really helped clarify things to me, is that a remote credential is needed when a model is created. And I find if I'm able to remember that, things make a lot more sense. So how was a model created? With the bootstrap command, recall that when you create a controller with the bootstrap command, it creates two models. So right away, we need remote credentials for those models, or with the add model command. Then when that's done, the remote credential gets related to those models or model. And now I think there might be some changes in the future, but right now a remote credential cannot be shared with another Juju user.
Yeah, I know there's definitely plans and ideas where, especially in large organizations where credentials are centrally managed for the company, for like central billing and whatnot. We want to support an idea in the future where, you know, the person who manages cloud credentials could, in theory, add them into controllers and then manage permissions to them based on teams or people across the company. And then that way they have the kind of essentially managed. And then the end users don't have to worry about ever actually seeing those credentials in real life. They would just basically be granted permission to use existing ones without having the actual keys. But that's all very much future design. We should get to that sometime, kind of work, to be honest.
So this is continued on to the remote credentials. So we list the remote credentials with the show credentials command. This is some example output. So here as we saw before with the local Gandalf credential, now it's a remote credential for that cloud, and it's now related to the models, controller, and default, as we can see at the bottom of that output. And also notice that the output says at the top controller credentials. The other output was saying local credentials. So it's possible, actually, typically not, but it's possible for a remote credential not be related to a model, and that can happen when the model is removed, right? The credential is still in the controller, or I guess in some corner case, I've heard that a private cloud may not even require authentication, although I haven't encountered that. Has anybody?
No, I think it would be more a case of, like you said, where, you know, the model using it is gone doesn't mean we wipe it because it's able to be used for future models and things.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so there's what credential is used when creating a controller. This is a scenario. So with the bootstrap command, a local credential is uploaded and it becomes remote, as we saw in the introduction. Which local credential gets used comes from a certain order. So this -- credential option is always the one that overrides everything else, followed by the default local credential, if it's set, or the sole existing one.
So I think it's worth pointing out that's the default local credential for the cloud that you're bootstrapping to. Right?
Yes.
So in theory, you have a different default for every cloud. Just to, you know.
Yes. So just to be a little more specific, we will get an error if all the following is true. So just looking at it from the other side of the flip side, if the credential option was not used, if there is no default local credential, and if there are multiple local credentials. So only local credentials are considered when creating a controller.
Yeah, there's definitely no idea of copying a credential from one controller to another.
Yeah. Now, what credential is used when adding a model? So this is another scenario. So with the add model command, this time it's the remote credential that gets used. We just saw before, it was the local credential. So again, we can still use the -- credential option. And when we do that, the upload method kicks in. So notice at the top, I say the remote credential gets used. Well, the -- credential creates a remote credential from a local credential.
That's what I was going to say. I think it's worth noting that the -- credential is always looking at your local bucket, right?
Yep. Or the sole existing one, right? If you're adding a model and you have one remote credential, this is a remote credential. So looking at what may happen if all the following are true, if the -- credential was not used and there are multiple remote credentials. So there is no concept of a default remote credential, as in the case with the local. That was clear?
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. So there's two other scenarios that I want to look at. They're sort of inverse of one another. So this one is what remote credential is related to a model. And the next one will be what models are related to a remote credential. So we use the show model command to determine this. And if our model is called default, the command is Juju show model default. And this is some of the output, partial output. So here we see that the model is called default, and the information we're after, the remote credential, is called JLauren. And I add other stuff that's available to us. The credential owner is admin, and the cloud name is AWS. Credential owner is just the user who uploaded the local credential. So the flip side of that is what models, if someone wants to figure out what models are related to a remote credential. So here we would use the show credential command. So for the Saruman credential on the Google Cloud, for instance, this is the invocation. Juju show credential Google. Google is the name of the cloud, and then the name of the credential. So here we're asking what models are related to that remote credential on that cloud. Output, and we see that remote credential Saruman is related to models Isengard and Orthanc, which is visible on the bottom. So there is the show credentials command, and that can also be used, and that shows all the information for all the credentials. Here we've just specified a particular credential.
To be clear, this is going to be limited based on what you have permissions to see, right? So as an admin user, you'll get to see a lot more stuff than your own information here.
Yep, good, very good point. Okay, so let's look at multiple users with credentials. So let's pretend that we've added a user and we've granted add model permissions to that user. So these are the commands: add user Frodo and grant Frodo add model. So once Frodo has registered the controller with the register command, I haven't included that. And if that user attempts to add a model called Shire, this actually will throw an error, because as we saw, every time we add a model, we need to think we need a remote credential. So because this user has just been initialized, there are no credentials for that user. So we may get something like this, telling us that there are no credentials, no remote credentials found. Oops, I went a bit fast there, but you get the idea. This is continued now. What do we do? So if so another scenario, if multiple credentials are then added, say potatoes and beer, and the operation is reattempted, it still won't work properly because there are multiple credentials, right? So this time a local credential is not selected from among the multiple ones available.
Ooh, we need a bug for that there. If there's multiple credentials and we're asking you to specify which one, it would be much better if that actually output what credentials would be solid options to use from that remote side.
Mm-hmm. So the local credential would then be uploaded to become a remote. Local credential will then be uploaded to become a remote credential, and the model can be added in this way, right? Mm-hmm. So now we're specifying that one of those multiple local credentials.
Gotcha. I mistook the previous slide to mean that you had added to the controller those two credentials and they were on the remote side.
No.
So that makes more sense than that the controller is not going to tell you which credentials you could use. Okay, gotcha.
Dealing with expired credentials. This is another scenario. So if your cloud vendor has expired your account credentials, and it happens, workloads will continue to run, but Juju will be unable to administer the cloud. On the vendor side, so what you need to do is, on the vendor side, you need to update that password, whatever mechanism the cloud vendor provides, usually typically at the dashboard or the API. And then on the Juju side, we need to do something. And we have two options in this scenario. We can either update the existing remote credential, and I will show details on how to do that in the next slide. Or we can create a new local credential and relate it to the affected models, whatever models the other credential was, the expired credential was related to. So the next two slides will look at these two options.
And to be clear, you have to do this per model, because this isn't just if the credential was expired, right? Juju doesn't actually know that it expired or is invalid in any way. It just knows that it's no longer working, right? Like it could be that someone regenerated the credential or something, we just don't know. But for some reason, the credential isn't working. You could also very much want to go, hey, I have these 10 models, my bill's growing, or I want to track my bill differently. You may want to just change some models to a production credential, right, that has bigger caps and more traceability or something. So the credential could still be valid, but you could still want to change it for other administrative purposes and things.
Right. One note on the bottom is that if an expired credential can be simulated by deactivating the account on the vendor side. So I tried this as I was going through this, and pretty much every cloud allows you to deactivate an account. Okay, so the two options. So option one was to update the existing remote credential. So we do that with the update credential command. And what happens is that the identically named local credential will be uploaded to the controller. So if you're using an existing credential, obviously you need to update that local credential first. The local credential contents, and to do that, the local credential contents are changed with the add credential command. And you need to use the replace option because that credential is already there. So these are the commands: add credential, replace, the cloud name, and then, well, here I've done it using a YAML file. And then the update credential command, cloud name, and then the name of that credential. So here I'm just specifying that the contents of the credential Gondoff was modified in that file. Credentials Gondoff changed. So interestingly, in Juju 2.6, I understand that a remote credential can actually be updated directly. So here we've done it indirectly, right? We've done it on the locally, and then we did it remotely. So actually, this is supposed to be able to work. That'll update it remotely.
Yeah, there's definitely work there where the credential stuff will work and operate against the controller by default in 2.6.
So this second option is to create a new credential and relate it to affected models. So we use the add credential command to create that new local credential. And the set credential command is used to relate a remote credential to a model. So if we say the affected models, in this case, are Shire and Rohan, these are the commands. So adding that new credential, and then set credential, model name, cloud name, and credential name.
And it's getting the name for that credential on the remote side from the actual YAML, right?
Yes, it's getting it from the right, exactly. So in the next, yeah, I had a comment for that.
Okay.
So just give me a sec. So yeah, here I'm just saying that the contents for this credential were added to file credentials Mithrandir, and yes. So as a bonus, with the set credential command, if that local credential, the credential we specify, is not found remotely, it'll actually look locally and then upload it for us. And that's what's happened here. That's what you were getting at, right, Rick?
Well, what I was getting at was that you're running this add credential command against the controller, and you end up with a credential that's called Mithrandir, but you don't actually anywhere specify the name of the credential as Mithrandir like you would when you add it locally. When you add it locally, you would generally say, here's a name or whatever, right? But I'm assuming that must be the root key of the YAML file is the name that is used for that credential.
Yeah, like the name is inside that YAML file.
Yeah, gotcha.
Right, that's what I meant by the contents for credential Mithrandir were added to that file. Okay, so dealing with a reanimated cloud account, this is sort of a variation of what we just saw. So a reanimated account is where you deactivate an account and then reactivate it. So it hasn't expired. The credential hasn't expired. What Juju has remotely is still valid. It's just that in this case, Juju discovers that it's been deactivated, and then it invalidates it internally. So you don't need to replace the credential's contents. We just need to tell the controller that remote credential is a good one. And the update credential does this. This is one of the things that command will do for us. So if we assume that the cloud account is associated with the remote credential Tharkan, the command is just that. We just use update credential, cloud name, and the name of the credential.
So once Juju detects the cloud credential isn't working, it no longer retries it to see if it becomes active again. It'll just stop.
Yeah, it backs off. We've had in the past where because a credential goes invalid, it creates load on the system to be continuously checking forever, particularly in cases where people have accounts that have gone away, but they may not come back to Juju to update that controller. So Juju takes the kind of safe by production standpoint and goes, okay, if this doesn't work, a credential, you don't normally get this credential's invalid and then it turns valid again, unless, like by accident. It tends to be a purposeful thing. So we require that kind of purposeful step to say, okay, Juju, you know what? I went over my limits of things. My account got turned off, or I didn't pay my bill. I went and paid my bill. Now I have to come back and say, Juju, go ahead and try again. You should get a different answer today than you did last week, kind of thing.
And that's it. That's all I got for you guys.
Oh, okay. Well, that's that. Great. That's a great walkthrough and clarifying some of the remote versus local. So that's fun. Oh, there he comes.
That was bad.
Did we hit the wrong button there?
Yeah, I hit the wrong button.
And that's all Peter wrote. All right. Let's see. Let me just check IRC. Are there any questions or anything in IRC? And the answer is no. So I think that leaves us with that. Anything else anyone wants to talk about today? Going once, going twice? All right. Well, then let's all run away and see you all in 2 weeks, where hopefully we'll be talking about 2.6 betas and making everyone or encouraging everyone to try to test and provide feedback. Until then, I leave you all with more fun and joy. Have fun. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.